from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. I'm Joe Matthew. Tonight, the Trump tariff chaos goes for the gold. The Trump White House tariff ruling roiling the gold market today in unprecedented fashion twice, stunning traders and throwing bullion markets into turmoil. We'll give you the latest details from Washington as the White House previews now a clarification on the issue in the near future. We'll take a look at how markets were sent for a spin. Plus, reports of the president's search for a new Federal Reserve chair expanding to include more top names. Who's currently on the list coming up? In addition to news, current IRS Commissioner Billy Long will be out of his post. Also tonight, news from within the Trump administration. Washington and Moscow now aiming to reach a deal to halt the war in Ukraine that would lock in Russia's occupation of territory seized since its 2022 invasion. What an agreement would mean for Ukraine, Vladimir Putin, and other nations watching the conflict as the President of the United States announces plans to meet with Putin, quote, very shortly. And the developments we're following out of Texas as Republicans take steps to bring back the Democratic lawmakers who broke quorum and fled the state. Governor Greg Abbott now appealing to the state's Supreme Court. And why Florida may follow suit now in redistricting plans that could mirror what we're seeing out of Texas. We'll have much more on that straight ahead. But we begin tonight with the latest coming from the White House. The administration telling news outlets to expect a new policy update on imports of gold in an effort to, quote, clarify misinformation after global markets reacted to news that gold bars would be subject to reciprocal tariffs enacted by the president just yesterday. That news leaving investors stunned not once but twice. First on the news, then on the expected clarification. Seems to have taken members of the administration by surprise as well, now that we have news of a still-to-be-determined policy update from the White House. Bloomberg's Derek Wallbank with us here in Washington. Scarlet Fu from global headquarters in New York. But we start here with Derek, who joins me live in our Washington bureau. It's great to see you here at the desk. So much for clarification following a week of tariff news here. Should gold bugs be worried about more bad news?
Well, Joe, I've got to tell you, the chart that we had on the screens just before we started this conversation, you could see on the right side, that straight line down, that was the moment when we got news from the White House that there would be a clarification on this policy. It's a little bit complicated, but the simple version is that gold is both a thing, it is a good that you could tariff in the form of necklaces, watches, things of that nature, but it's also a financial asset, and it's also kind of a haven currency in a way, and it's traded sort of between Switzerland and London and New York. And Switzerland, as we all know now, is facing, just now faced 39% tariffs. The idea that the gold bars coming through Switzerland would be subject to those Swiss tariffs really sort of wrecked with some of the trade flows of gold, some of the futures contracts and things. And so that's why you saw, initially the idea was that they weren't going to be subject to the tariffs. And then there was a customs clarification that, in fact, they would be. When that happened and that sort of came out, that's that first point of almost chaos, as you mentioned. The rollback of that now, putting that a bit down, unwinding some of those moves that we saw.
A bit of a round trip here. I don't know if I should be buying gold bars at Costco in the meantime, but it really is kind of indicative of what we've seen since Liberation Day, that swoon we saw in the stock market following the first news of reciprocal tariffs. But that's faded into the mirror a bit here. When it comes to stock investors, they don't seem to care less about the tariff rates announced yesterday.
And that is something that Donald Trump is using to sell the idea that people who disagree with his overall tariff push are wrong. I think this is one of the things that economists have been talking about a lot right around the world. There have been a lot of predictions and projections that some of the tariff news would show up in economic figures. It hasn't really, although to be fully fair, the tariffs as Donald Trump envisaged them on Liberation Day really have only just gone into effect this week. So a lot of this has been a sort of promise that has taken a while to really kind of work through. And as you say, sometimes something goes into effect And then the White House says, "Ooh, hold on a second. That's going a little bit too far. That's maybe having some unintended consequences." And they've been willing to roll that back.
Fascinating. Thank you for walking us through all of this. It's been a doozy of a week, Derek. I hope you spend more time in Washington. Bloomberg's Derek Wallbank. We thank you. Some developing news out of the White House tonight, important, with the Wall Street Journal reporting that the president's team is reviewing additional contenders to be the next chair of the Federal Reserve. The Journal reporting former St. Louis Fed President James Bullard and former economic advisor to President George W. Bush, Mark Summerlin, joined the previously reported top picks. Here they are: National Economic Council Director Kevin Hassett, Fed Governor Christopher Waller, and former Fed Governor Kevin Warsh. Now, Bloomberg News has reported that it is Fed Governor Christopher Waller who is the top pick among the contenders being reviewed by President Trump's advisors. Joining us now with reaction to this latest news, the tariff update we were just talking about with Derek, Scott Lincicome, Vice President of General Economics at the Cato Institute. It's great to have you with us, sir. Your thoughts today on the news from the White House. If we could start with tariffs, and in this case, gold, more confusion thrown into the marketplace. How much more of this can we take?
I think we're going to need to take a lot more of it. The reality is that whether it is finalizing some of these trade deals, whether it is getting technical instructions from customs on what qualifies as transshipment or originating in a certain country, there are a ton of details yet to be ironed out, and that is a ton of uncertainty. You know, something like the gold issue, that's maybe a 1 day or even a few hour issue, but a lot of this stuff will linger for months into the future, and that's got to weigh on real investment and business decisions as well as trade patterns.
Well, it's kind of interesting, as Derek just mentioned, Scott, the president is actually crediting the health on Wall Street to the tariff program on Truth Social today. He said tariffs are having a huge positive impact on the stock market. Almost every day, new records are set. Isn't the market setting those records in spite of the tariffs?
It seems so. I mean, if you actually look at manufacturing stocks, which is where you would see kind of your direct effects of the tariffs, because, you know, about half of everything we import are manufacturing inputs, things used by American manufacturers. Well, manufacturing stocks are actually down compared to the S&P in general. The reality is that the United States is a massive $30 trillion services economy. And what's powering stocks today are things like AI and other tech stocks that are only indirectly affected by the tariffs. The stocks and the companies that are directly affected, they're not doing so hot. So I think it is safe to say that we'd actually be doing even better, given some of the things in the tax law that was just passed related to full expensing, for example. We'd be doing even better if it weren't for all these tariffs and, again, the uncertainty that is just roiling a lot of investors right now.
Well, you know, it was just today that we had Wendy's telling us that some lower-end consumers were starting to pull back. They're not eating breakfast as often, just like McDonald's told us a couple of days ago, which is always an indication that people aren't necessarily working because they're not buying breakfast. They're also not going to Sweetgreen for salads, it seems, from the office at work. You could also look at Procter & Gamble raising prices on a number of its goods, a quarter of its consumer products. Black & Decker had a tough story to tell about tariffs. I could keep going on this list here, Scott, but we went to ground yesterday at a grocery store in Connecticut. I spoke with Ernie Tedeschi as well today. I was going to talk about Stu Leonard for a moment, but Ernie Tedeschi with the Yale Budget Lab talked about the unpredictability surrounding President Trump's tariffs and the potential inflationary impact, some of which I just described. Here's how he put it.
The better argument, I think, comes from the Federal Reserve that has looked into this. And they say, look, it's not just a mechanical one-time price level effect. There are effects on supply chains, the supply side of the economy, and that has a risk of being, if not permanently inflationary, then, you know, persistently inflationary over 2 to 3 years. I think that is what Jay Powell and the board is worried about.
It brings us back to this idea, Scott, that the White House has put forth that tariffs are not inflationary because it's a one-time spike in prices. But you've also got a lot of economists talking about boiling the frog out there, that, yeah, you get this one-time bump, but then there's continued creep maybe over the months and years ahead as tariffs continue to have a more corrosive effect. We get mail every time we talk about this. Economists disagree with the administration. Where are you?
Well, I don't foresee tariffs being persistently inflationary, but it is really hard to game out exactly when you're going to get that so-called one-time price bump, because the reality is that there are so many different companies with so many different business strategies. They're holding a lot of inventories. Those are dwindling down. They're deciding when to eat the tariff cost, when to pass it on. You have American competitors that are deciding when to raise their prices as well. And then, of course, you have how this is going to leak through into auto insurance prices and health insurance prices. So it could be something that really is a sort of a one-time price increase, but a one-time price increase that actually takes more than a year to actually work its way through the CPI and the PCE. That's a much harder thing to figure out. You know, it's not going to be just a very simple and clean one-time jump. I think it'll take a little while before we reach that peak, and then it starts to level down.
Talk to us about India. It appears the president's tariff threats against India, which were doubled this week, remain in place absent a deal, and I realize that could still come here. But where are we going to see the biggest impact? Is it what we pay for our next iPhone?
Well, for now, consumer electronics are exempt. You saw the big display with Tim Cook in the White House earlier this week.
Sure did.
The issue, I think, is well, of course, we want to watch consumer electronics to see if that exemption stays, because a lot of companies moved their, like Apple moved their facilities to India to avoid tariffs. But there are a lot of other consumer goods that have followed that same business model, appliances and other things. And that's where I think you actually will see some pretty substantial price pressures. A lot of these products that were moved to get out of China and are now getting 50% tariffs. That's a brutal pill to swallow.
What's the most important deal the president could cut? Is it China? Because that could take a long time, Scott.
Well, China's, I think, still the big uncertainty, because right now, we have a deadline coming up very shortly that the current truce between the two countries will end. And so there's a lot of question about, is that going to continue? What's going to happen going forward? Given that these are really the two largest economies on the planet, given that, just a few months ago, we had 130% tariffs in place, that's certainly a huge issue. And it's also a huge issue given China's role in global supply chains, whether it's rare earth elements or just simply intermediate goods to United States manufacturers. That's a huge issue, I think, and the next big shoe we have to wait to see how it drops.
Yeah, that's for sure. That deadline that Scott mentions with China is next Tuesday. We'll see if it stays there. Scott Lincicome, great conversation. Thank you for the insights. He's Vice President of General Economics at the Cato Institute. Now, the initial gold tariff announcement that we talked about caused quite a stir in the markets. Just some of the voices reacting today on Bloomberg.
Gold has been well supported by a number of issues anyway, running all throughout this year. But the tariff fears, that component of the market had cooled down up until last night.
When I think about gold, this becomes a story of diversification and really emphasizing the need to be diversified across your portfolios.
It's been one of our highest conviction calls, honestly, for the past couple of years, and we still expect upside from here.
Gold has always been too heavy, too slow, and you can't really ship it across an ocean. And if you do, now you're getting tariffs. So I really think it just reminds everybody why the digital version of gold is better than actual physical gold.
Since then, the administration suggesting it would issue a new policy clarifying that imports of gold bars should not face tariffs, as we alluded at the start of the program. We'll see how that pans out. For a look at the markets watching all of this, we turn to power moves tonight with Bloomberg's Scarlet Fu, who joins us from World Headquarters in New York. Scarlet?
And really, the Trump administration's ruling that President Trump's tariff would be applied to these gold bars threw everyone for a loop, especially in the commodities market and especially in the gold industry. You look at futures, they rose to a record high on this news. And remember, futures are backed by the gold bars that would be subject to those tariffs. Now, later on, as you mentioned, after Bloomberg learned that the White House is looking to clarify the misinformation tied to these tariffs, we saw prices ease and you saw a relief right away. Right now, they're pretty much little change on the day. Gold futures, though, have had this tremendous run year to date. They're up about 26% in U.S. dollar terms to those record highs. There's a lot of concern, obviously, about rising debt burdens in the U.S. and in other industrialized nations, as well as concern that inflation is accelerating, and gold has proven to be an effective hedge for those who are worried about rising inflation. I also want to point your attention to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. These are the government-sponsored entities jumping by double-digit percentages, as you can see. According to the Wall Street Journal, the White House may sell between 5 to 15% of equity in these companies. The IPO expected to raise about $30 billion. These are government-sponsored entities that play a big role in the U.S. mortgage market because they buy conforming U.S. mortgages from lenders, which frees up those lenders to make other loans, and then packages up that debt and sells them off. Now, the government bailed them out right before the great financial crisis, and they have been in conservatorship ever since. But a lot of investors, including Bill Ackman, the hedge fund billionaire, own stakes in one or two of these companies and have been lobbying the White House to make a decision on privatizing these companies. Other big gainers of the day have been Mag 7, and they've been gaining pretty much since the market lows in early April. They've led the market's rebound. The index is now at a record high, and one particular standout has been Apple. The shares surged 13% this week. That is the best weekly performance since summer of 2020, Joe. The company will be exempt from additional semiconductor tariffs that President Trump has mentioned because of its commitment to invest another $100 billion in the U.S. for manufacturing. Back to you.
Amazing what a trip to the Oval Office will do. Bloomberg's Scarlet Fu, thank you so much for the help this week, Scarlet. Coming up, the redistricting battle could be heading to Florida, with Republican lawmakers now exploring the possibility of redrawing their own map there. We'll discuss it with Democratic Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman-Schultz of Florida up ahead. But first, the world is awaiting details for the anticipated summit between President Trump and Russian President Putin. We'll discuss what the meeting Trump says will happen very shortly could mean for the war in Ukraine with James Jeffrey, former U.S. ambassador to Iraq and Turkey. He's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
I think we're getting very close, and we're going to be announcing later on we're going to have a meeting with Russia. We'll start off with Russia, and we'll announce a location. I think the location will be a very popular one for a lot of reasons.
It's Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. Breaking news within the last hour. President Trump there confirming he will meet with Russia's President Vladimir Putin to discuss ending the war in Ukraine. Date and location TBD. Joining us now with more on Balance of Power, James Jeffrey, former U.S. ambassador to Iraq and Turkey, now distinguished fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Mr. Ambassador, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. It's great to have you. Bloomberg is reporting today, according to people familiar with the deal still in process, that the truce that we're talking about would call for the lines as they are to be frozen. Essentially, Ukraine would give up the Donbass and Crimea officially to Russia. If that's the case, is that a non-starter for Volodymyr Zelensky? What would the war have been worth?
Thanks for having me on. Well, the war for Zelensky has been worth keeping Ukraine more or less alive and under sovereign leadership of the Ukrainian people. And if that's the deal, then he has achieved this. Much of the Donbass and Crimea, of course, were taken in 2014. Whether the line will be frozen as it is now, or there will be adjustments. Trump mentioned that in passing. The Russians want the two northern provinces, Donetsk, which they basically have already taken, and rather Luhansk and Donetsk, which they've largely taken, to be part of their new Russia. They may be willing to give up territory they've taken to the south in Zaporizhzhia and Kherson provinces, or oblasts, as they call it. The devil is in the details on both the line of demarcation of where you have a ceasefire, how the Ukrainians will deal with recognizing and not recognizing formally the loss of territory. We went through a very similar situation with Korea in 1953. The Korean president, King Sigmund Rhee, did not want to go along with this. In the end, we basically said, that's the way it is. Korea still recognizes North Korea as part of its territory, but of course it hasn't been there for 70 years now. So we'll have to see what the details are. But we are certainly in a whole different situation with Ukraine. It's clear that the pressure Trump put on Russia through the arms transfers, the threats about moving nuclear submarines, and the sanctions that he's about to unleash and has already announced for India, it looks like it's had an effect on Putin.
Interesting. The president mentioning earlier in an unrelated event at the White House that there could be a land swap of sorts between Russia and Ukraine. You may have just alluded to it. Is that Zaporizhzhia, Kherson that you're talking about? And to what extent would we trust Russia to hold to that agreement?
That also came up in the meeting, trust but verify, and Trump said he has to. There has to be two sets of political, diplomatic security arrangements on top of any ceasefire and line of demarcation. One is Ukraine's ability, if not to join NATO, to have continued outside military support as it has now from Europe and the United States. The second thing, where Russia, frankly, has had a point for the last 30 years, is what is the security architecture of Europe or much of Eurasia, and what is Russia's role in it, what is NATO's role in it? We really haven't had a serious discussion with Russia on that issue since Bush 41, 30 years ago.
You worked for Donald Trump as special presidential envoy for the global coalition to counter the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant. You went after ISIS. To what extent does his personal involvement at the table with Vladimir Putin affect outcomes?
Every president's personal involvement on the table is both essential and varies from president to president. Trump, at the tactical level, is totally unlike anybody else, including the other presidents I've worked with. But at the strategic level, as we're seeing in situation after situation, you mentioned the unrelated event today. Well, that's a peace treaty between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and it's not unrelated. That takes away the whole Caucasus that used to be part of the Soviet Union from Russia's grasp. It's another chess move by Trump. He knows what he's doing at the strategic level. He's been president now for almost 5 years. It's a tough job, but it's also a job that you learn a lot in.
Fascinating, and I appreciate you connecting those dots, Ambassador. The president was asked about venue today, and he tried to play that down as something less important, but it seems like venue is critically important. In our remaining moment or so, what would you suggest? Because many have said the Middle East. Is there such a thing as a neutral location for these two to meet?
There are plenty of countries in the Middle East, including Turkey and the United Arab Emirates, that have best possible imaginable relations with both the United States and Russia. It'll be someplace like that.
Fascinating. So Saudi Arabia, UAE, and at that point, just lastly, Ambassador, does Volodymyr Zelensky need to be at the table?
Volodymyr Zelensky and his parliament and ultimately his people have to agree to the final solution. That is absolutely essential. When he's at the table, when he isn't at the table, that's something for Trump and Putin to work out. Frankly, I've been involved in dozens of these things in one or another way, and it always comes to the United States sitting down with the hostile force and hammering out an agreement that affects some basically ally.
Thank you, Ambassador. James Jeffrey, former U.S. ambassador to Iraq and Turkey. Come back and see us again soon. This is Bloomberg.
Members, may I have your attention? The roll has been called and a quorum has not been established. For those that have fled to Illinois or to California, be reminded that the FBI's assistant has reportedly been enlisted, and their powers are not confined to any singular state's boundaries.
Texas Speaker of the House Dustin Burrows earlier today announcing state Republicans officially cannot move forward with their redistricting efforts with Democrats still out of the state. This has been going on for days. Texas Democrats fanning out across the country to break quorum and block the legislative attempt. to redraw the state's congressional maps, despite threats of their arrest. If you're with us on Bloomberg TV, a live view at Sacramento right now, where California Democrats are holding a news conference on this, knowing that California may answer Texas if this happens. The latest escalation today in Texas, where Attorney General Ken Paxton filing a lawsuit in the Texas Supreme Court to declare 13 Texas House seats belonging to those lawmakers officially vacant. On Wednesday, the FBI granted Texas Senator John Cornyn's request to help with locating the absent Democrats. Paxton and Cornyn are, of course, in a bitter Republican primary for the state's upcoming Senate race and getting a lot of ink along the way. Here with the latest now is Bloomberg's Texas Bureau Chief Julie Fine. Put a finer point on this for us here, Julie. Are we done then with this special session? How do Republicans revive this effort if they plan to?
Well, I mean, all these, threats are out there that the seats are going to be vacated, that the FBI is getting involved. You heard Dustin Burrows there say reportedly giving assistance. Well, you haven't seen the FBI go in yet to Illinois. You haven't seen the FBI go into California. And this is the FBI, and it's very well known where the Democrats are. There's about 7 days left in this special session. You don't see any signs of the Democrats going back. At this point, generally in quorum breaks, you might hear a little bit about some cracking with the group. We have not heard that yet. I don't want to say that the special session is over, but at this point, it certainly doesn't look like anybody's hightailing it back to Texas, Joe.
Yeah, understood. If the governor did want to take another swing at this, what would be the process? Because as you've explained to us, Julie, it's not just redistricting, it's passing relief for flood victims in Texas.
Well, first of all, they can go ahead and bring out the flood relief bills. However, there are not enough Democrats there to pass them. The Senate can pass whatever it wants to pass. Again, as you know, both sides have to agree before it can go to the governor's desk. Without the Democrats, currently there are no new bills on the way to the governor's desk during this special session. But Joe, as you and I have gone over several times, the governor can call as many special sessions as he would like.
Well, this will be quite a moment when the Democrats come home. Julie, thank you so much. Bloomberg's Texas Bureau Chief Julie Fine working overtime this week for us against the backdrop of redistricting. And as we've told you all week, Texas may not be the only Republican-leaning state looking to redraw its congressional maps ahead of the 2026 midterms, with now Florida Republicans as well exploring following suit. The State House Speaker outlining in a memo to fellow lawmakers the first steps of a redistricting plan that could secure more seats for the GOP. Joining us now with her reaction to this is Democratic Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman-Schultz of Florida. It's great to have you with us, Congresswoman. We understand that this could be happening 7 years ahead of schedule. There's a chance that you would lose your seat by next November?
Joe, what this is really about is very clear. Republicans know that their disastrous agenda, where they took away health care from millions of people, blew a massive hole in the deficit, extended the debt limit exclusively so that they could give more and bigger tax breaks to billionaires, is wildly unpopular across the country, and they are headed to lose the majority next November. So instead, what they're doing is they know they're not going to win the election on their agenda, so they're trying to ram through changing congressional districts so that they can have the legislators choose their voters instead of the other way around, and do that for expressly partisan purposes. In Florida, voters in 2010, by more than 2/3, voted to install prohibitions in our Constitution called the Fair Districts Amendments that tell the legislature they cannot draw districts based on to favor or disfavor a political party. In other words, they can't draw partisan districts, and they can't draw districts to favor or disfavor an incumbent. And they are clearly organizing to do that in Florida in direct violation of the Florida Constitution and thumbing their nose in the face of Florida's voters who were clear in their intent.
Interesting. Well, I want you to hear a good taste of what we've been hearing from your Republican colleagues about this issue. We spoke earlier this week with Congresswoman Beth Van Dyne of Texas, who said this is about redistricting efforts happening in her state because Democrats already started this spiral. Here's how she put it.
California has already done this. New York has already done this. Illinois has already done this. Massachusetts already done this. Maryland already done this. What was frustrating to Democrats is that Republicans are now doing this. But the fact is that you've got a president who, if he does not win the midterms, will not be able to complete his agenda to the American people that they all supported, 2 years ago. And on top of that, what my Democrat colleagues have promised is that they are going to defund ICE and they're going to spend the last 2 years of this presidency on impeachment.
This rhetoric gets to be beyond even the tie. I can't even cut the. What is your reaction to that, Congresswoman? Why is this different in Texas?
Joe, that's a long way of her saying that they are drawing districts with partisan intent because they can't win an election on their agenda. And they know that they have to have legislators choose their voters, and they have to rig the construction of congressional districts. By the way, the congressional redistricting took place across the country in the states she named, California, Illinois, other states, at the regular decennial census. They are trying to ram through new congressional districts, partisan districts, and pick up seats because they know when voters go to the polls next November, there's a freight train of opposition to their agenda that will run over them. And in Florida, particularly, it is directly, explicitly unconstitutional. I have colleagues in Florida who have specifically publicly stated that the reason that we need to change congressional district lines in Florida is so that they elect more Republicans and more conservatives. That's unconstitutional, and it's very transparent. And if and when they do it, it'll go through the judicial process, and hopefully we'll be able to make sure those are overturned.
Well, I guess we'll see what Democratic states would do in the meantime as well, the promises from the likes of California.
We're not going to
I want to ask you about something else.
That's for sure.
Understood. I'd listen, as Jake Auchincloss put it on this program the other day, if Democrats will use brass knuckles if Republicans decide to. I want to ask you about something else that's happening in your state, though, Congresswoman. We asked you about it last time you were here, and that's this so-called Alligator Alcatraz detention center, migrant detention center, where construction has been halted because of environmental concerns. This week, Tom Homan, the president's border czar, talked about this new ICE detention facility, along with others that are being constructed, and whether, in this case, Alligator Alcatraz is the model. Here's what he said.
1,000 beds come in very handy, and I'm glad the states are stepping up to help us do this. Every bed we bring on, we fill pretty quickly. I'm glad governors are stepping up, but I'll say it again. I would like to see bigger facilities that be more efficient, holding several thousand people. But 1,000-bed facility is a great help because we need those 1,000 beds. We need them today. So the quicker they bring it on, the better.
Well, agree with him or not, a judge has paused construction at Alligator Alcatraz. What does that mean for the people already there, Congresswoman, and will you attempt to stop it permanently?
The abuse that's taking place in this Everglades detention center, which is an internment camp, for lack of a better term, is breathtaking. On top of that, the judge was absolutely correct to temporarily halt construction at the detention camp because it is in the midst of the Florida Everglades, an hour and a half in, as I mentioned last time I was here, and it is on sensitive environmental lands, which is why the airport that was originally planned in the 70s was scrapped because it was deemed too environmentally sensitive an area to build that kind of infrastructure. On top of that, Joe, Governor DeSantis just said the other day he admitted that 100 people who were legally in the country were deported from the Alligator Alcatraz detention facility. They detained and kept a 15-year-old, which is illegal under U.S. law to have a minor in an ICE detention facility. This is an abusive boondoggle that is costing taxpayers twice as much as any other detention center, and more than twice as much harm. It needs to be shut the hell down, and I hope the judge eventually does that.
I have to ask you, before you leave us, Congresswoman, about what's happening in Israel, where the Security Cabinet approved a plan for the occupation of Gaza City, more restrained than the entire occupation of Gaza Strip as Benjamin Netanyahu had first proposed. But we're obviously dealing with a humanitarian crisis here, and now we're adding a military occupation. The chief of staff of the IDF told Benjamin Netanyahu he would be walking into a trap. How, as a Democrat, do you straddle this politically by supporting Israel, but also looking out for the betterment of Palestinians who are suffering?
This is not political in the least, Joe, and I know you didn't mean it to sound that way. This crisis could end It was started by Hamas on October 7th, 2023, when they invaded Israel, slaughtered 1,200 Israelis, took 250 people captive, have killed many on that day and since then. And it could all end right now if Hamas agrees to release the hostages, and we could have a mutual ceasefire and everyone could move forward, which is absolutely essential. Gaza needs to be freed from Hamas. That's what really needs to happen. And of course, we need humanitarian aid to get in there because the civilian population that is suffering does need to have the coordination through the United States and Israel and the Arab nations to get humanitarian aid in there to stop the suffering. But Hamas controls whether or not that suffering stops. And Israel's security must be at top of mind when it comes to that aid moving in and out, because we know what Hamas does with the aid.
Well, following our support militarily of Israel, is it incumbent upon the U.S. to help get food aid into Gaza?
We're already engaged in getting food aid into Gaza, and unfortunately, you have Hamas that is interfering with and intercepting the aid that gets in there. I know that the ambassador is ramping up that food aid, and Israel needs to continue to be cooperative, and as they have been, but a lot more needs to be done.
Come see us when you're back in Washington, Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman-Schultz of Florida. It's great to have you with us, as always, on Bloomberg. Coming up, the Justice Department is opening up an investigation into New York Attorney General Letitia James over the multi-million-dollar civil fraud case she brought and won against President Trump. We'll bring you the details, and we'll look ahead to next week's anticipated meeting between President Trump and Vladimir Putin with our political panel. It's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew. We thank you for joining us. We'll turn back to our lead story in President Trump's impending summit with Russian President Vladimir Putin with our political panel. First, the stories we're watching in today's Power Brief. President Donald Trump is increasing the presence of federal police around Washington, D.C., just a day after suggesting he could act to seize control of the entire capital city. The effort would see law enforcement from more than a dozen agencies deploy for at least a week. The White House source telling Bloomberg that it comes days after a former DOJ staffer said he was assaulted in a weekend carjacking attempt, prompting the president to cast Washington once again as a crime-ridden city. Police stats show violent crime in Washington is in fact at a 2-year low. NASA and SpaceX say its Crew 10 mission will undock from the International Space Station in just a matter of minutes. 3 astronauts and a cosmonaut are completing a 5-month science expedition conducting experiments aboard the ISS. If weather conditions cooperate for the undocking, splashdown off the coast of California is scheduled for tomorrow at 11:33 a.m. Eastern if you're watching 8:33 a.m. local. And the Justice Department is investigating New York Attorney General Letitia James over the $454 million civil fraud case that she won against President Trump before the 2024 election. DOJ officials have convened a grand jury and have sent subpoenas to James's office, according to people familiar with the matter. The investigation will reportedly focus on whether the case, which alleged that Trump exaggerated his wealth to dupe banks, violated his legal rights. A spokesperson for the New York Attorney General's office saying they, quote, stand strongly behind our successful litigation, unquote. The DOJ declined to comment on Bloomberg's reporting. Also today, the Wall Street Journal reporting the DOJ is also probing another vocal Democratic critic of President Trump, Democratic Senator Adam Schiff of California. Now back to gold, something that has long been on the president's mind, recalling his one-time fascination with Fort Knox.
All my life I've heard about Fort Knox. That's where the gold is kept, right? I heard Fort Knox, oh. But, you know, we're getting a little bit shaky. We're getting the yips on this stuff. Like, I want to find out. So we're going to open up the doors. I'm going to see if we have gold there. We want to find out. Can you imagine if we open it up and there's no gold? Well, I think there will be. For one reason, it's really heavy. You know, you steal a bar of gold, you got to be strong. And if there's 27 tons of gold, we'll be very happy. I don't know how the hell we're going to measure it, but that's okay. We want to see lots of nice, beautiful, shiny gold in Fort Knox.
Ah, the memories. Joining us now with their reaction this evening's political panel, Bloomberg Politics contributors Rick Davis, Stone Court Capital partner, Republican strategist, alongside Democratic analyst Jeannie Shanzano, political science professor at Iona University. When we put this whole thing together for the program tonight, I realized they never went to Fort Knox. Is that why we got the tariffs today?
Must be a Gold Friday.
I guess it's like, right. We have to make a run to Costco. Does he need to go to Fort Knox? Maybe he could make up with Elon Musk there. That was his idea.
Are you saying Rick? You're pointing at Rick.
Well, I'll go for it. Tell me. You ready to go?
Yeah. I think Rick. I love.
I hear they give
case
samples.
Of the yips.
Got the yips. I don't know what that fascination was, but I guess we're not going to Fort Knox.
Not yet. There's always time, though, Joe. We're only 7 months in.
Yeah, it's 200 days. But we're apparently not going to tariff gold bars either. The White House seems to be pulling back on this idea that sent the market on a tizzy, so confusion reigns.
Yeah, as usual. It's troubling to even keep up, difficult to keep up with where they are at any given moment. So if you told me tomorrow or Monday the tariffs on gold bars were back on again, I wouldn't be surprised at this point. But for now, they seem to be off for the weekend.
I remember the ads of all the former congressmen selling gold. This is a whole different thing. The gold in the Oval Office, it is kind of ironic that he's tariffing the very metal that he's cast about his entire office. But it does remind us of the week that was. This was actually the reciprocal tariff week. They're in place. The tariff regime is here, save Mexico and China. How long does it take for the market to start worrying about this, or is the administration right? Doesn't care?
Well, I think that they probably built in the risk associated with the sectoral tariffs, the things that are going on, and now these. But it's the tariffs to come, like the surprise we had on gold, the surprise we had on India getting an early tariff on Russian oil. Where does the last foot land in China, which is, look, realistically, the three biggest trading partners we have, Canada, Mexico, and China, are still in a flux, right? So the rest of the world is settled, but like that is small compared to those three countries. Yeah. So there's plenty of, I think, sort of booking things to a risk state, and I think, it's not going to end here. And this administration uses tariffs in lots of different ways. It's not just to balance trade, and it's punitive. It can be rewarding. I mean, so any given day, we could see something different.
Well, that's, I guess, the problem and the definition of uncertainty here. We talked about this with Scott Lincicome a little bit earlier this hour, Jeannie, and we've all talked about it here on Balance of Power. Today it was Wendy's. A couple days ago, it was McDonald's. Lower-income consumers having trouble spending and buying, particularly on breakfast, which you also start to see when people are losing their jobs. Add Procter & Gamble, Black & Decker. At some point, the anecdotal data has to bump into the hard data, no?
Yeah, that's right. And I think, you talk to most economists and you talk to them every day, they say that we are just starting to feel these effects on the ground. And, as a political scientist, I would say there are the effects on our pocketbook, which are can be devastating and real. But there's also long-term impacts on U.S. national security, our political power around the world, as the president imposes enormous tariffs on some of our closest allies. That has long-term implications for us as we do things like confront China. We have a very small labor market compared to China. To confront them in a concerted way, we need allies to join with us. All of these things are long-term and nothing that the market would respond to on a day-to-day basis. But that's why so many people, aside from economists, are concerned about this unprecedented tariff war.
Understood. Let's talk about political power around the world, because the president's trying hard to wield it when it comes to Russia and Ukraine, Rick. And we got some more updates today. This afternoon, the president talked about his highly anticipated meeting with Vladimir Putin. They say it could happen as soon as next week. Listen.
I'll be meeting very shortly with President Putin. It would have been sooner, but I guess there's security arrangements that, unfortunately, people have to make. Otherwise, I'd do it much quicker. He would, too. He'd like to meet as soon as possible. I agree with it. But we'll be announcing that very shortly.
We've learned a lot about the geography of Ukraine together over the last few years, and the idea of a truce, as Bloomberg is reporting right now, to freeze the lines essentially in place now, give the Donbass to Russia, give Crimea to Russia officially. Is that even a starting point for Volodymyr Zelensky?
Well, we don't know if that's a starting point for Vladimir Putin, right? His conditions that he's put on these discussions in the past have been outrageous, right? And to the point where demilitarization, can't join NATO, can't do any of these things that Western nations want them to become a part of Europe. And so it's going to be a sum total of all those things. And I think the lesson we've learned, and it's been a painful lesson for Vladimir Zelensky, is he's ready for a deal too, right? I mean, like, he's in deal-making mode. Wow. And I think the one thing the president has that's right is that the killing has to stop, right? This war is going nowhere. Zelensky has already won. He has kept Russia out of Kyiv, right? That was their objective when they started this. They weren't looking for a couple of pieces of land in the Donbass. They were looking for Ukraine. And that's never going to happen, right? At this stage, you can say with confidence that's off the table. So where do you get to at this stage that allows the Ukraine's territory to be sovereign in the future, right? Not just today, but what guarantees are we willing to give them if Russia decides to get an itchy trigger finger again?
Yeah, right. Well, yeah, so it seems like there will continue to be a place called Ukraine, but a deal that very much favors Russia, and one that questions the level of trust that we can have, having seen Russia break these agreements before.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, to a certain extent, as it pertains to just this meeting, it feels to a certain extent like Vladimir Putin has the upper hand. He benefits from meeting with the president of the United States. He's the one saying that he doesn't want to sit in a room with Vladimir Zelensky, to Rick's point, who has been saying, I want all of us to, I want to meet, we want to meet face to face. So this very much seems to be moving in a trajectory that's on Vladimir Putin's terms. And whatever you think about the terms he's proposed, they have been remarkably consistent throughout. And I haven't seen yet one bit of evidence that he is willing to play ball. The one thing he said was he wanted this fandangled air truce, which only benefits Russia because they have much more strength than Ukraine on the ground. So very little, sort of indication that Vladimir Putin is doing anything but showing the world that he is of a stature to meet with the president, which is a win for him.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure you don't trust Vladimir Putin, Rick. To what extent should this president, when you're sitting at the table without Europe involved here, Europe's going to have to swallow whatever Donald Trump agrees to?
Yeah, I think that Europe will do things that it may be in excess of this agreement, right? I mean, like, they're not bound by this agreement, and they'll make that totally clear. You're right. I mean, he may say this is an agreement to stop the war, and if Zelensky says yes, Putin says yes, then he's got a deal. But NATO and Europe are going to have a say in how to keep Ukraine safe in the future, and I think that is going to be critically important. I just hope, too, Europe takes very strong stand on future purchases of Russian oil, and there are $300 billion worth of Russian rubles sitting around somewhere. I hope that goes to the Ukraine for reconstruction, because they deserve it.
Well, next week could be an awfully important one, and we'll be lucky to have Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano walk us through it. Thank you both so much for a great panel and for all of your insights. Programming note for you, be sure to tune into a brand new episode of Wall Street Week tonight on Bloomberg TV and radio. You'll find a conversation with former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers. Thank you for joining us on Balance of Power. This is Bloomberg.